The idea is to be a fair-minded current affairs site covering Israel and the region and the Jews. I think that there's tremendous common interests, a great deal that connects between Jews all over the world. I think people don't appreciate that sufficiently. I want to play that up. I think there's a crying need for coverage of Israel that is not partisan, that is not skewed by an affiliation with one political party in Israel, or that is not enslaved to a particular mindset. Now, obviously, we all have our preconceptions and we all have our judgments, but we try to present the news in almost some of the mindset of a print publication, where you can see what's important by how prominent it is on the site, how big the headline is, how large the picture is. These are things that many websites don't do. They just slap material and it scrolls through and the latest thing is at the top and so on. So we've tried to take a traditional, healthy journalistic approach and tried to bring some of those hierarchical values, what matters most, to the web. And that's really quite unusual. Most people can't actually do that technically. Look, the obvious potentially existential threat is that you have a regime in Iran. This is not the Iranian people, but it's also not a single person, Ahmadinejad or Khamenei. It's a regime. It's a regime that is dedicated to seeing the demise of Israel and is closing in on the capacity to bring that about. Now, we don't know if they got the bomb, whether they would use it. There's a small body of opinion in Israel that thinks they might. There's another swathe, if you like, that thinks they might supply a bomb to a third party and maybe delude themselves that they could evade responsibility. But even the majority, I think, of Israelis who think they may not use a bomb right away realize that our reality changes if Iran goes nuclear. The balance of power in this region changes. Our capacity to determine our destiny as effectively is constrained. There's a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, and these people, they are rapacious territorially and ideologically. You know, we are the little Satan, America is the big Satan. These are not just words. They think that the Western approach to life on Earth is flawed and irresponsible and discriminatory. They, of course, are misogynistic, homophobic, extremist, a bleak regime, but they're closing in on the capacity to swing their weight around. And that's incredibly problematic for Israel. And if you listen to the rhetoric of Israeli leaders across the spectrum, Israel is saying it cannot be reconciled to a nuclear Iran. And how that's going to play out, well, we'll see fairly soon. And I think, Israeli leaders are facing fateful decisions, because if Israel does not intervene militarily relatively soon, it will lose its capacity to do so, and it would have to rely on the stronger, better equipped United States, and that means Israel places its destiny in the hands of a very good ally, but still out of its own hands. And that's a big concession. That's a radical move for Israel to make, to subcontract its security to the United States. And that's why this is such a hot issue at the moment. But I would take Iran beyond that, because I think Iran is also the state champion of an incredibly troubling reversal of momentum. I think when Sadat flew to Jerusalem in the end of the 70s, it was because that there was this sort of reluctant conclusion that they couldn't get rid of the Jews. They tried on Yom Kippur to attack this country. Israeli intelligence was exaggeratedly confident after the Six-Day War. We didn't think anyone would dare attack us. We were surprised. We were underprepared. We didn't want to believe our own intelligence. We suffered heavy losses, but we ultimately survived and prevailed in that war. And the Egyptians, lots of factors, but ultimately came to the conclusion, we can't get rid of the Jewish state. We're going to have to make some kind of reconciliation with it. And then a long time later, 15 years later, but still, Jordan followed suit, and we began opening interest sections in Bahrain and Qatar and Oman and ties of some sort with Morocco. And you had the sense that the circle of normalization was widening, that gradually this region was coming to terms with the sovereign revival of the Jewish nation. Well, there's a lot of factors here, and some of them are central and some of them are more marginal, and it's not always easy to work out which are the dominant factors. But I think, among them, I think the fact that Israel's a democracy is a handicap that we willingly carry, but it's a handicap. You can advocate for Israel and you can explain why Israel has a right to exist, and you can be talking about very different Israels. You get 10 Israelis speaking on CNN or the BBC. I can imagine you'd have somebody who thinks we should annex historic Judea and Samaria, and somebody who thinks we should go back to the pre-67 lines, and every range of opinion in between. How Jewish a country should this be? There is no single Israeli narrative. Of course there isn't. It's a democracy. Everybody has their own opinion. You get Palestinian spokespeople to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They will all trot out a single line, which is, all we want is a state, and the terrible Israelis are denying us that state, which is, I happen to think, quite dramatically not the case. I think Israel sometimes seems to me more desperate to partner the Palestinians towards statehood than the Palestinians are. Our only caveats are that they're a state not come at the expense of ours. But I think the narratives, because of the asymmetry between a democracy and a relatively non-free Palestinian entity. There are plenty of worse regimes in the Arab world. I think that's a disparity that works to Israel's disadvantage. I think demographics are a big factor. If you're a reasonably fair-minded politician in a British constituency with 10 times as many Muslims as Jews, taking a fair-minded position on Israel can cost you your job. That's a big factor. In a Britain where the most popular new boy's name most years, I think, is Muhammad, in a France that has 10 times as many Muslims as Jews, and so on. So I think demographics plays into it. I think there's a misconception of the underdog. I think there's the sense that because Israel is militarily very strong, surely we can impose reconciliation on the Palestinians and the rest of the region. Well, we can't. First of all, we're not interested in using our force to change the political reality. And in any case, that's not how you achieve reconciliation. There has to be a desire for reconciliation on both sides. We're militarily strong. We are territorially puny. I mean, worse than a David to a Goliath. Take a step back from a map of the Middle East, and if your eyesight is not, anything worse than 2020, you can't even see Israel anymore. It's a tiny little speck. Demographically, 7.75 million people in a region of hundreds of millions who are either indifferent at best to Israel and largely fairly hostile to Israel. So there's a misconception, I think, of the balance of power. People assume, well, if only Israel would give up the territory, there'd be peace. Well, that's not so straightforward. Israel didn't control the territory that we are told, if we relinquish, will gain us peace from 1948 to 1967, and we certainly didn't have peace then. And when you're 9 miles wide at your narrowest point, if you relinquish all the territory, there are some pretty compelling security arguments to be made. By the way, I think Israel would be prepared for radical territorial compromise in a context where it believed that it had peace. But I think there are a lot of misconceptions. I think most people don't know what I just said about the size of the country, that it's an hour and 15 minutes to Sderot on the Gaza border, that you can drive top to bottom in this country in 8 hours, that it is 15 minutes across at its narrowest point. And when you have that ignorance, I think that is another factor here, that people think, well, the great big Israelis, they make so much news, they must be territorially vast, why don't they make peace? I think ignorance is a big factor as well. I think anti-Semitism is somewhere in the mix. I don't know how significant it is. I think in different countries it plays into it. But I think those are some of the factors. The single Palestinian narrative, the complexity of the Israeli narrative, the misconceptions about basic factors of this country, some of the ignorance about the history of this country. Demographics, I think, is a very, very big factor, a really big factor. I mean, think of yourself as a British politician. If you didn't really care about Israel, why would you potentially risk your career not to be pro-Israel, just to be fair-minded about what's unfolding in the Middle East? So all of those factors, I think, play in. I think I don't know that I can point to one or two or three specific sources of funding that are peddling an anti-Israel narrative in traditional media or in new media. I think in the world of 2012, everybody's capacity to weigh in and at least to think that they're being listened to, but to put themselves out there, is hugely enhanced. You couldn't do that before. Newspaper editors and television producers controlled people's access to information. It doesn't work like that. And the consequences of that in this part of the world have been, truly revolutionary. The fact that in Egypt they saw over Facebook and over their computers what had happened in Tunisia, they had no idea. They didn't know, the relative difficulty of their plight compared to others. They didn't know that others were rising up or could rise up. All of a sudden they saw this happening in a nearby country. They recognized that Mubarak was weak. They ousted their president. So the capacity for everybody to understand what is going on around them, is like it never was before, and that has implications in every direction, including that it empowers people who want to say very nice things about Israel. That has implications for everybody, including that it empowers people who want to say nasty things about Israel, and empowers people who want to say nice things about Israel. And there are probably, if you just look at the numbers in this part of the world, there are certainly more people who want to say nasty things about Israel than want to say nice things. I think that, coming back to some of the root factors, there's a misconception. Which is really sad, that to be pro-Palestinian you have to be anti-Israeli, when I would like to argue that we would all be best served if we promoted reconciliation and accommodation and compromise, and you could be pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian. I think that the debate becomes more shrill in an internet era. I think people become more set in their views in an internet era. I think these are all factors. It's coming back to my profession, when you'd open a print newspaper, you didn't know what you're going to find on page 2 or page 3. You turned the page and you faced a selection of articles that you had not chosen to read. You'd chosen your newspaper. Now on the internet, you're looking for material essentially to reinforce your worldview. I think there's less readiness to countenance debate. I think people are less exposed to conflicting arguments because they're getting their current affairs online than they were in a traditional print newspaper. So those are all factors. And then something that I haven't commented on before, there's Israel's culpability in not waging war terribly effectively on the second battlefield. We have a political leadership here that is the victim of a dreadful political system, pure proportional representation. It means the Prime Minister is not even, his party is not even the majority in his own coalition. We've never had single-party government in Israel. You sit at the cabinet table, there are 30 people, 30 ministers around the table, all of whom think they can do a better job than the Prime Minister can. The art of political survival is like a daily imperative, and I think it pushes aside some of the other things that prime ministers ought to address and that the hierarchy ought to address better. I don't think Israel devotes enough attention to disseminating its narrative effectively. It certainly doesn't devote enough resources. I think one of Israel's most recent public relations disasters really was the flotilla, the interception by Israel of the flotilla of vessels that were sailing towards Gaza in May 2010, ostensibly to provide humanitarian assistance, which was, I hope most people realize, was a gimmick. Israel is supplying anything that anybody wants to supply over land. It maintains a naval blockade and an air blockade of Gaza because every crack in that security regime is exploited by Hamas, which runs Gaza, which violently took control of Gaza, to bring in rockets and other weapons and ammunition to fire at Israel. So yes, we certainly maintain a blockade on Gaza. We endeavor to ensure that that does not have grave humanitarian consequences, and if anybody feels that things need to be got into Gaza, well, then bring them over land and they'll get into Gaza. This was, a deliberate effort to destroy the security envelope around Gaza, and Israel made clear, we will intercept these vessels and we will bring them into port and we will transfer the cargoes overland to Gaza as long as they don't contain weaponry and so on. All but one of the vessels in this flotilla complied. The Mavi Marmara did not. Israeli naval commandos went to commandeer the ship, expecting that they would be confronting peace activists, and therefore they went on board with paintball guns and their personal weapons. Instead of being able to smoothly take control of the ship, they were attacked. In some cases, they were beaten within inches of their lives, and they opened fire in self-defense. Now, Israel had footage of them being beaten on the deck of the Mavi Marmara, and you could see the clubs and the sticks rising and falling. You could see the silhouettes of their attackers pounding these commandos. But Israel did not release that footage for at least 6-7 hours that day, for various considerations that may have been valid but were not sufficiently valid to outweigh the need to get that film out, because the Israeli oral version of what had happened, which was, well, Israeli commandos were attacked by thugs on board this boat, it was not credible without the video evidence, because these were peace activists, weren't they, sailing on a humanitarian mission to Gaza? How on earth would Israeli soldiers, crack Israeli soldiers, have had the need to open fire and kill people? Only when you saw the footage could you better understand, shall we say, the Israeli account of what had happened. That, delaying that footage is, an unacceptable PR fiasco in the modern era. You can't do that. And I'll tell you very personally, the next day I had 2 TV crews that came to interview me about it, and they came to speak to me. Both of them said, because they felt they'd done Israel a disservice in their reporting the day before. They hadn't believed the official Israeli account of what had happened, and to their great credit, they were doing a follow-up piece. Now that shows you what a difference releasing that footage in good time would have made. I think Israel officially can be very defeatist. It thinks, everybody hates us and it doesn't matter what we say, they're going to spin the story against us. Well, I don't think it's true. I think most journalists there are certainly plenty of ill-intentioned journalists. Most journalists that I've come across are well-intentioned, don't want to be wrong, certainly, don't even want to be unfair. They want to get the story right. Here you had 2 cases of people who actually took steps to get the story right. But a great many journalists, I think not unreasonably, drew wrong conclusions about the flotilla incident and wouldn't have done if that footage had been out there earlier. And that's like a little case study in how a more effective awareness of the media battlefield would help Israel with its narrative.